No, I'm not actually. I'm sitting. I don't know quite what to do about this. No, I'm sitting in front of the window, but it's late afternoon, so
Yep.
it's not that the sun's coming in at me or anything. Is this acceptable, or can I do something about it? What do you think?
You can do whatever you want. I'm fine with it. We're appreciative that you are on, sir.
Oh no, my pleasure. But I don't, as long as this doesn't look too terribly bizarre. Well,
Well, as the sun goes down on your end, you'll be slowly revealed.
well, that may happen. Let's see what happens. All right, let's do this. Let's see what happens. Right.
Ramsey, I'm Pat. This is Brennan. I know you've
How
been
you
talking. Before we start, we always talk to every guest super quick. Is there anything you don't want us to talk about? If so, we will not bring it up, and I'll take a note of it.
Elephants. I prefer not to discuss elephants.
No
but if
elephants.
we have to, I'll do it. How's that?
David, I guess we're going there.
Have you guys seen the film Relic at all? Relic?
I have not. No.
I haven't. I know what it is about, though.
With Emily Mortimer. It's pretty good. I mean, it depends on how you feel about something like The Babadook, which ends up very obviously symbolic in the last, few minutes, and this does that trick as well. But the one thing I will say about The Relic is it has a scene around the 60-minute mark, which is more like a nightmare than anything I've ever seen in a film. It was just like living through a nightmare for about 10 minutes. It's absolutely terrifying.
I gotta check that out. Relic, RRL.
Like a nightmare you would have yourself, Well, I mean, David Lynch movies are like nightmares. David Lynch is imposing on you, which is fine. But this is like something I could genuinely imagine going to bed tonight and having that precise nightmare, and thinking, my God, this will never end. But I won't ruin it for you. Take a look sometime.
I just wrote down. Yeah, I gotta check. If you're recommending it, yeah, I'm gonna check it out.
That's fair.
Welcome to Dead Headspace, now a part of the Silver Shamrock Horrorcast, a podcast network that includes Killing Time with Silver Shamrock and Unburying the Dead, where we exhume old horror paper classics for the new generation. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Ghana, and all other major platforms, which now includes YouTube. That's right. You can now watch your favorite episodes, which includes this one. All you have to do is search for Dead Headspace. I'm your host, Patrick R. McDonough, joined always by my co-host, Brennan LaFaro. Say hi, Brennan.
Hello, everybody.
And today, we have with us a very special guest, a writer who has received more awards than any other writer in his field, including the Grand Master Award of the World Horror Convention, a few lifetime achievements, amongst many others. Please welcome Ramsey Campbell. Hello, sir.
Hey, well, listen, guys, what Patrick is too polite to say is that he's exhuming an old horror writer this week.
So I'm just going to jump into it, man. I've seen plenty of interviews with you. I've watched some documentaries, but for those that haven't, mainly this will serve a good purpose, is what got you into horror?
Oh, okay. So we're going to have the half-an-hour question first, right? How far do we go back? Listen, it depends on what we mean. I mean, the very first thing I remember terrifying me was when I was, maybe not even 2 years old. Now, this sounds absurd, but I was terrifyingly precocious, to a fault. So I was already reading before I turned 2 years old. And in England, we have a newspaper cartoon strip called Rupert Bear. Actually, there was a Paul McCartney movie that possibly you saw. It was a half-hour animation, but it doesn't really matter. Rupert was a staple of British newspapers for decades, and often enough, he encountered strange, sometimes kind of eerie things, in the woods. Little creatures, little stick men, that kind of a thing, that was supposed to be charming for kids, but weren't necessarily. And in fact, there were apparently complaints from parents over the decades saying, this is too scary for our kids. Now, the one I remember, and as I say, maybe just turning 2 years old, was Rupert's Christmas tree. in which Rupert basically chooses a tree from, I mean, I'll simplify the story. He chooses a little sapling, little fir tree from the forest, brings it home, or it actually comes home magically and, appears in the tub outside the house. Christmas Day, during the party, he hears what he describes as a little high voice behind the tree. Now, even 2 years old, I was savvy enough to figure, look, that's not behind the tree, it's in the tree, it's somehow talking. And at this point, I began to get uneasy. That night, he wakes in the night, hears a kind of scurrying noise downstairs, looks out the window, sees this kind of skeletal silhouette scuttling away back to the forest, goes downstairs. Tub is empty. There's a trail of earth leading out the front door. He follows it. Believe me, I wished he hadn't at that point. And eventually pursues it, into the forest. And there's an image that I think it was the one that ultimately did for me, where he's clambering up a kind of rock face, and the tree is perched above him on its roots. This kind of scrawny roots, claw-like roots, and kind of it would be peering down at him if it had a head, so it's kind of bending its top down towards him. Now, all these images, the little high voice, the sound you hear in the night, this kind of the trail of earth, for God's sake, it's all classic M.R. Jamesian supernatural horror stuff, and presumably it was meant to be toned down for kids, but all that meant for me was it showed just enough to suggest infinitely worse, and already my imagination was working in that way. So, okay, skip forward not very many years, because by the age I was 6, I was borrowing books from the adult local public library on my mother's ticket with her say-so, because, books in libraries, hardcover books apparently were respectable. You couldn't buy pulp magazines, but, not 6 years old you couldn't, although there's a bit of a story to come on that in a moment. But, little did she know that half the books I read out of the library were, collections from the pulp, the very pulps that she would have disapproved of. But anyway, that's another story. Now, 6 years old, I borrowed 50 years of ghost stories from the public library. Now, ghost story, horror story, those are terms I think that overlap a great deal. A lot of what you call a ghost story is supernatural horror. A lot of M.R. James's, for sure. And the image that really there were two images out of that book really stayed in my mind when I wish they wouldn't, when I was trying to get to sleep at night. One of which was somebody opening a chest of drawers and opening one drawer after another, and on the bottom there's just a bundle of linen, and a little pink hand comes groping out of it, something like a baby's hand. And then the other image was of somebody going into a room in the dark and seeing something very vaguely in the gloom, and then enormous feelers like insect legs come groping out in the dark and feel over his face. Now, either of those, would have given me a many sleepless night put together. They gave me decidedly, weeks of unease. Now, it turned out both of those are from an M.R. James story, The Residence at Westminster. And so, I suppose we could say that in terms of adult horror fiction, James was the first to do it for me. And from that point onward, really, I was borrowing everything from the library that I could find that was within the field, but science fiction too. But then again, a lot of science fiction, probably particularly more then than now. A lot of short science fiction, a lot of Bradbury, a lot of Frank Long, and there were some early, some small scale Lovecraft stories within these anthologies. So I was really, getting to know the classics at a very early age. And, before long I was allowed to buy books, certainly hardcovers, because again, they were respectable. So, I got my collected Edgar Allan Poe and eventually got my collected M.R. James. And then, by gum, those did for me all over again. And I think there's probably James more than any other single writer, who just did it so intensely that they were what I most wanted. I suppose we could say this, I know you guys will agree with this, that the difference between a horror fan and the people who say, no, I don't like this stuff, is that, effectively it's doing the same to us as it does to that person. Whereas they say, right, I don't want any more of that. We want to go back and repeat the experience, or have something comparable. So that's what makes us what we are.
Absolutely. And oh my gosh, I got so many thoughts there. But let's start with the imagery you gave us from the M.R. James story. You kind of finished up by saying that imagery might have the same effect universally, whereas we want to dive deeper into it. We want to explore it further. And yeah, as soon as you described those, and also the imagery from the Rupert Bear story, my first reaction was, oh, no, thanks. But then right after that passes, I say, okay, now I want to know more. I want to know what's attached to the end of that tiny pink fist. Or do I? Maybe I don't.
You won't find out, actually. That's as far as he goes with that. But yeah.
Well, and that's the thing is my imagination is going to potentially conjure up way worse stuff than a reveal at the end of a story. So I think that's the perfect way to play it. Now, I'm curious, not being familiar with Rupert Bear, do you feel like that episode and maybe some other ones were universally accepted as, wow, this is kind of some creepy stuff? Or is it just, is that the imagination of somebody who'd go on to become a writer, putting connotations on it?
Probably a bit of both, I suspect, because while I don't know that I've not seen any other reactions besides mine to that particular story. As I say, there were a fair number of complaints to. It was the Daily Express that used to run the strip, actually, from the 30s onwards, really. And funnily enough, my old friend Mark Morris, the horror writer. He cites a different Rupert Bear story. Well, actually, there were a group of Rupert Bear stories with these little sort of gnarled stick creatures whose I can't remember the name of them now, but that did similarly for him as the Christmas tree did for me. So, but of course, that may just mean that we are particularly warped, Mark and I, and no wonder we ended up the way we have.
Brennan, you got anything else to add to this? If not, I have a question of Ramsey's older stuff. I think.
No, I'll throw it to you in a second. I was just going to comment. I read a story a couple months ago, just released in 2020, that kind of preys on the same type of stuff. That a family brings a Christmas tree into the home, and you hear kind of scurrying around in it, and it just embarks on this whole big thing. Now I'm starting to wonder, is that because the author of that story is not a British author. Maybe they're familiar with the series, but I'm wondering if that's inspiration or if that's just a universal fear.
Maybe universal. Do you remember who wrote this story?
Yeah, it was Ronald Kelly, and he put out a book of Christmas horror stories in December.
That's interesting, because there's also an H. Russell Wakefield story that's very much sort of along those lines, except in the Russell Wakefield, it's particularly a sort of pagan thing. It actually appears to have been taken from a druidic grove, so they get what you might expect from that. But now there's a strange thing now that this is going off the point a little bit, but maybe not that much. I think it is kind of universal, because there are two things. The other thing you can't predict, I think, is particularly when you're young, is what's going to terrify you, or indeed what's going to terrify your children. And we found this with both of ours, you see, because our daughter, our daughter and our son are now way grown up and living away. Our daughter's in London, our son's in Singapore. But our daughter, the only thing that really terrified her, and she woke sort of pretty well screaming in the night, was The Railway Children, the movie. Now, there's one thing we thought, well, that's absolutely fine. That's not going to be any problem. But it was the image of the trees slithering down the railway bank when the kids have to stop the train, hence The Railway Children. But it was just that image of the trees moving. I mean, she knew nothing about the Rupert Bear story. And our son was. Now, we went to a press show of the movie. I mean, actually, William F. Nolan, had recommended this to us as something that all the family would enjoy. It was a movie called The Journey of Natty Gann, a Disney live-action film. It's about, I would to summarise very, very quickly. The central character, a young woman, young girl, adolescent girl in the Depression era, has to go across America to find her father, and she befriends a timber wolf that's been kept in a logging camp as a kind of fighting dog. But it's very much a Disney thing with the animal friend who defends her. It's a bit less sentimental than most Disney actually. It's a bit hard edged, And I would also say, this is off the point in a way, but when she finally gets to her father, who she's been looking for the entire length of the movie, this teenage girl, he turns out to be Ray Wise. Now, those who have seen Twin Peaks might feel that the father you find turning out to be Ray Wise is not a good omen somehow, but that's a different thing. But the point was, it's a Chicago, as I remember it. She finds him, a shanty town outside Depression era Chicago. So she has to send the wolf away, and she sends him into the woods. And that's the end of the movie. That is very moving, Anyway, lights came up at the end of the movie, and I turned to my son, who was then 5, to say that was pretty good. And he was shaking from head to foot and absolutely inarticulate, sort of sobbing. And when he eventually kind of regained his speech, he said that was a sad, frightening film. And what apparently was particularly bad about it was just this image of sending somebody back into this dark wood. And that, somehow, again, it's a sort of an archetype, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
And you can find it, I mean, hell's teeth. I wrote a book called The Darkest Part of the Woods. The start, which kind of, if you like, epitomizes it. And of course, Alfred Blackwood, greatest story is The Willows, which again is trees. And, you can find, I don't know, in Lovecraft, you can certainly find unnaturally mobile trees in The Color Out of Space. And so it goes on. So, I think the woods, they're deep in our shared subconscious, I believe.
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to change gears a little bit, but it goes back to, I don't know if it's the first thing you ever got published, but I did see that something stuck up to me with your first collection, which came out 12 years before your first novel, The Doll Who Ate His Mother. But the collection, the original title, looks like it wasn't the intended title, is The Inhabitant of the Lake and Less Welcome Tenants. What stuck out to me was it's not under Ramsey Campbell, and that's people might not know that's not your first name. It's John Ramsey Campbell. Why'd you go with that, and why did you not stick with it? Because I can't find anything else under that pseudonym, I guess I'll call it. I don't know what the proper title is.
Well, no, it wasn't my original name. That's
okay.
The name I got from my, on my birth certificate. I mean, much late, some decades later, I actually, legally got rid of the John because basically it sort of got in the way I thought. I mean, actually, funnily enough, before that first book was published by Arkham House, August Derleth was my editor and friend too, in those days. Still was till he died. Now he suggested I should leave the J off actually and just do pure Ramsey Campbell. And I kind of thought about it. And it was actually Jack Chalker, the editor of Mirage, the fanzine, who actually published an early story of mine and was a Lovecraft specialist. And we were corresponding, and I just mentioned this to him, and he said, "Oh no, he said no. Ramsey Campbell sounds like a spoiled Scottish duke. So keep the J," he said. So I was swayed by that, and so I did. But after a while, I thought, well, no. And the other thing was basically, I said we couldn't say John Ramsey Campbell because it sounded too much like John Campbell of Astounding. We obviously didn't want that confusion. Not because because it would confuse people. In fact, I'll tell you one time, by God, where was this? This was the Worldcon in London, I think, and our local science fiction group, of which I was a member, took great pleasure in saying, "Here, John Campbell, meet John Campbell." So, we finally came face to face briefly. Anyway, I'm way off the point now, and have I answered your question? Yes, sort of, about the J, that's right. No, it was just basically, I felt, I do think just Ramsey Campbell works better, and so it's gone. It's sloughed off like an extra appendage, a tentacle.
Does I'm just assuming most people don't know that John's your first name, your birth name.
Mhm.
Do many people find that surprising? Have you noticed that? Has it even been brought up before?
Don't think many people even know it anymore, and obviously just to kind of complicate the issue, as you say, the inhabitants of the lake and less welcome tenants was a misnomer because it was supposed to be other unwelcome tenants. That was what August suggested to me. But the problem was that when he gave the cover brief to the artist Frank Utpatel, who did the cover on the Arkham House edition, he gave him the wrong title. I think because his own book, Mr. George and Less Pleasant Persons, that had just come out. It was due to come out, and obviously he mixed the two up. And by the time we realised, well, the cover was actually printed, and obviously it would have been prohibitive in those days because we weren't then electronic. So we just had to go with that. But I did restore my original title on the recent PS edition, which is by Ramsey Campbell. So it is now inhabitant and other unwelcome, and it also has all the first drafts in there as a sort of extras, Easter eggs, whatever you want to call them.
So you worked with August Derleth, and I hope I pronounced his last name right.
Yeah, Derleth, I believe so.
Okay, yeah. So that's pretty interesting. I'm a big Lovecraft fan. My wife, when I met her when she was I'm from Massachusetts, about 30 minutes north of Providence, and she went to college there, and I spent a lot of time there, and I just love I went to Swan Cemetery. I checked out the few places that have markings of Lovecraft, and that's where I started starting to really dive into his mythos, and that's before I get off track there. How did you first come across August, and how did that friendship blossom? And if you want, man, like for those that are unfamiliar, if you want to just talk about him for a minute too, that'd be awesome.
Yes, absolutely. Well, listen, I suppose I should just go even a little bit further back to give you an absolute context for this. So, I mean, I said earlier, M.R. James is the guy who first really, gave me that intensity. And I started writing stories, not particularly Jamesian, but just basically bits of favourite stories that I had read all put together, like Frankenstein's monster, really, terribly ungainly things. Now, it may seem very unlikely this to all our listeners, but in the early 1960s, no Lovecraft collection had been published in paperback in Britain. There was no such thing. One day, looked at a bookshop window, and there's Cry Horror, collection by H.P. Lovecraft, for £0.50. And, I actually remember scrabbling around in my pocket thinking, my God, have I got 2 and 6? Because if not, this book will be gone by the time I come back. I'll never see it again. I think in those days, I was sufficiently naive to believe, if you didn't get that copy of a book, you'd never see another copy of that book. So anyway, I found, got £0.50, bought the book, took it home, basically skived off school the next day so I could read the book from cover to cover, which I duly did. And, it had the call of Clue, however we want to pronounce the old guy, and the colour out of space, rats in the walls, several of his greatest stories. And by the end of that day, I was convinced that not merely that Lovecraft was the greatest horror writer I'd ever read, I actually felt he was the greatest writer I'd ever read. And basically, before very long, I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to do something along these lines. And I actually did start writing stories which were, trying to add a little bit to his mythos. So it wasn't, yet another story of Clue, but it was, trying to pick up a little sidelong references in some of his stories and expand those. So I wrote, 4 or 5 of those. I just wrote them longhand, actually. I still do write first draft longhand, actually.
Oh, wow.
One of my correspondents was a fellow member of the British Science Fiction Association called Pat Kearney, who is now a distinguished literary historian, actually. And he edited a fanzine called Gaudi, And he asked if he could see these stories. You know, I mentioned while we were corresponding, I mentioned I'd done some Lovecraftian stories. So he asked, could he see them? I sent him, well, such was my naivete, I sent him the only copy in the world, a handwritten copy, through the mail. And I don't think I registered it, actually. But yeah, it got there safely, and it came back to me safely. And he said, could he maybe use one of these stories in his fanzine? So, okay, he duly did. And he suggested, why didn't I ask August Derleth if they were, what he thought of them? Because Pat obviously liked them, and he felt, Derleth being, well, he was, really the world's authority on Lovecraft at that time. He would be the man to say. So I duly wrote to August and said, basically, I've written these stories. Would you like to see me and see them and, just tell me what you think? And that was all I wanted. It wasn't, will you publish them? I genuinely just wanted to see if he thought they were any good. And he actually said, well, look, we're going to need to see these if you have any ideas about publishing them, because, we hold the copyright on Lovecraft's ideas. Well, that's always been a controversial issue, but that's what he said anyway. And I see no reason to have a problem with it then. So I duly typed them out, sent them to him, and he eventually said, he'd read them through, and there were a lot of problems basically. But he said, if you want to do the work on them and do some more stories along these lines, we do think it might be a potential Arkham House book. Now, 15 years old, that's pretty fighting talk, So
yeah.
I kind of picked myself up. I thought, yeah, I'll do this. And he did send me a long editorial, list of editorial suggestions, particularly for one story, and then basically suggesting I should do same things to the other stories. So okay, I duly did that. Wrote some more stories, and he actually published the very first of them when I was 16, which was a story called The Church in High Street. Now, he said, when I sent him the rewrite, he said, no, he still was not happy with it, but if I would allow him to edit it, then he would use it. Well, okay. Again, I said yes, and he did. And the editing he did was certainly necessary. I mean, I would have liked him if there had been time to say, this is wrong, and I would have then have rewritten it along those lines. And I think you can at times see the joint. You can see where it's more Derleth than me, but what the hell? It works, and it got me into print when I was 16. And so here I was alongside Robert Bloch and H. Russell Wakefield, for God's sake, which pretty well did for me. And then 2 years later, The Inhabitant did indeed come out. And, we corresponded for long, ever after that. He encouraged my work, and also was very much a sort of paternal figure. And in fact, our correspondence is published by PS Publishing. It was a letters from Arkham. Or was it Letters to Arkham? God, I can't remember my own title. This is what Senility is like, guys. You
have so many books, man.
Yeah. That's right.
That's fantastic. Brennan, I got questions, but go ahead, man.
No, go ahead. If you got follow-ups, hit it.
I was going to wait till later, but Robert Bloch, I know for sure that, because I've seen you mention that you were correspondence with him. I'm curious what that was like, because, I mean, me and Brennan, we do this other podcast that I mentioned at the beginning of the show with Ken McKinley. He's a publisher for a publisher called Silver Shamrock, and we cover the older classic horror paperbacks. And the first one we did was Ghoul with Brian Keene. Second one is Robert Bloch's Psycho. First time me and Brennan's ever read it was the end of last year, and I'm a fan. How can't you like him?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Now, listen, let me ask you this, see if this kind of resonates with you. I'm convinced, I don't. This may not have been intentional on Bob's part, but I sort of feel that Psycho is a kind of a riff on The Thing on the Doorstep, in the sense that it's about somebody else who is possessed by the spirit of a corpse in the cellar. In fact, a woman's corpse in the cellar. I'm not ruining this for anybody. And also, not in the Hitchcock film, but in Bob's novel, he's got occult books in his library. which is, a decided hint of something a bit stranger, I think, Just a thought.
Brennan, I feel like we kind of talked about that because we in the book, and I do find it funny that you and Brian Keene have said Bob, and it seems like that's what his friends called him, which is
yes.
Just as a student of the genre, I find that kind of interesting. But we did notice that he has all these books on the occult, and like one of them that sticks in my mind is what is it, Drum Skins Made of Human Flesh, and
Oh yes.
how that starts out with Mother Not Approving. But if we didn't say that specifically about a possession, I absolutely can see that because it's subjective, but you have a strong case for it. And yeah, now that we're talking about it, yeah, I could see that, man.
I mean, it may not even have been intentional. It's just one of those strange things that may have, lodged in his mind, if you like, because clearly it was based on Ed Gein more than on Lovecraft. But even so, maybe Lovecraft's a bit in the background there. I don't know. You were asking what it was like to correspond. Well, we did meet as well, actually. I mean, we met at the we met several American conventions because I went to quite a number of those, and we originally met at the first World Fantasy Convention in Providence in '75, in fact. And he was just as genial and funny as you might imagine, actually. And it's strange, just because. In fact, have a look online later when you get the chance, because there is a Robert Bloch Appreciation Facebook group, and I've just posted on there because I found it just the other day.
I'm not familiar. I've got to check that out.
Yeah. I looked up. If you look Robert Bloch on Facebook, it'll take you there, I think. Yeah. So I've just posted up this letter from Bob that I found the other day, and it's straight. I mean, it's typical of Bob. Because he said, this was, I'd obviously said in my letter to him that I'd had the proofs of his, typical of Bob, what he calls his unauthorized autobiography, right? Once around the block. And so the Tor had sent me and some other people, page proofs for a quote. And of course, I certainly gave him a quote. And he said that's good because the only other person I've had a quote from is Saddam Hussein.
Interesting.
Yeah, I didn't really know what to say.
Yeah.
Bob's
Ramsey, you keep apologizing for going off the point, but don't ever do that. We love that. Less questions we have to ask, the more we get to hear from you. We're happy.
Okay, let me just follow up on something then here for a moment, because I was just saying about the first World Fantasy Convention. And, it's strange because my friend John Probert was saying this to me quite recently, that, I sort of feel that what I hope to be is sort of a link in the chain that is our field, or a sort of, a stage of it, somebody who's, kind of taken from what came before and maybe passed on a little to people who come after, But what John was specifically saying was that I'm kind of, which is unnerving really, I'm one of the last links to that classic generation of pulp writers, because, Bob, not only did Bob become a friend of mine, but Manly Wade Wellman, who I also met at that convention, Frank Belknap Long. Frank was, he was a likable guy, but I'll tell you what, if you imagine Stumpy in Rio Bravo, the Walter Brennan character in Rio Bravo, with a Brooklyn accent, you've got a pretty fair sense of what Frank was like. In fact, you have to look at, actually. It's kind of strange. And oh God, who else did I meet back then? J. Vernon Shea and Lord Hugh B. Cave, And so all these people became friends, because we kept meeting at World Fantasy Conventions, and there was that whole generation of which I'm part. And the sad thing is, all these guys, Charlie Grant, Dennis Etchison, Carl Wagner, and I'm the only one left, really. I had a. This is. I don't want to get too morbid about this, but by God, there's a book called Arkham's Masters of Horror, which Peter Ruber edited way back now, which was basically stories from the surviving Arkham House writers, And I recently had a Spanish translation of that, and the publishers had put in a note saying, "To the last living contributor."
Oh no.
No, I've got a lot. I've got a lot of stuff to hold up that, I suppose. I don't know.
That's yeah. I don't know how that would feel. I'm in my 30s, but I can't imagine that. I just
Well,
wanted. Sorry, go ahead, Ramsey.
you go on, go on.
You brought up one thing, and we talked about this a little bit, and I just checked out. I had to Google it. I checked out the dates for Ed Gein when he was actually brought to trial, which was in I think it said 57, give or take. Bob's book came out in 59. First edition came out in 1959, and I don't know. I could be wrong, purely guessing, but it seems like he was the first one to take inspiration from a serial killer that exploded, at least through the nation at the time, and wrote about it and created his own monster. Because I know that Ed Gein was responsible for many fictional monsters, but three of the massive ones are Norman Bates from Psycho, Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs. So it's needless to say, he's one of the most for lack of a better dreary word or phrase, he's the most inspiring serial killer.
Yes, I think that's true. There's also a very good movie called Deranged with Robert Blossom as pretty well, obviously, Ed Gein, and
Yep.
in some ways closer, I suppose, to how Gein behaved.
I got to check that out too. Wow. Brennan, go ahead, buddy. You seem like you had a good question.
I was gonna jump in. So I'm glad you brought Block back up. I was gonna jump in a while ago and about the whole occult book thing. The one conclusion that we all came to when we were, discussing that book for upwards of 2 hours was there's just no fat in it. It's lean, it's mean, and every choice is intentional. So I mean, to me, when the rest of the book could be shelved as like psychological thriller, the inclusion of those books has to be intentional, and I would assume that there's, I don't know whether you count it as an Easter egg or a hint to bigger things. There's reason to bring that detail up.
And Ramsey said something too, which I laughed and I didn't want to interrupt earlier. I think you apologized for maybe a spoiler in that book, but even if you don't like horror, man, you know that the mom's dead and he's like dressing.
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you, by now?
I could be wrong.
Yeah, because I don't know, because I mean, I've just sort of tried the other, quite recently I was trying to find out how many people knew the point of Murder on the Orient Express, the Agatha Christie novel, and a lot of people don't. And if you don't, we mustn't spoil it for those who don't. But Agatha Christie had this. I mean, she was brilliant at coming up with something you could only use once, but that was one, and Roger Ackroyd is another, and there are others which I won't even talk about. But I've been rereading her quite recently, and in fact, I recently did a novella, which was kind of my sort of response to Agatha Christie, which is going to come out from PS Publishing pretty soon. There's going to be a collection of novellas actually. But this is a new one out of the 5. This is one that's new, called The Village Killings. And because the thing was this, you see, this thing about cozy crime, and people tend to treat Agatha Christie as a kind of cozy writer, in one sense, obviously that's true, because at the end, everything is neatly tied up, and usually the villain is turned over to the law, brought to some kind of justice. But it just kind of occurred to me that although that's true, when you're reading an Agatha Christie, particularly if you've read a few and you know the kind of thing to expect, though you really don't know what to expect, but the way her mind works. So you're reading those books and you're kind of scrutinizing the most innocent actions and the most innocent lines of dialogue in case of something hidden behind them. Now, that's pretty damn close to paranoid schizophrenia, it seems to be. And that was kind of where I went with this story. But more than that, you'll have to wait and see when it's published.
Absolutely. I love that idea that an author kind of builds that expectation where you have to read their work with a fine-tooth comb.
Mm.
And, speaking of that, of an author developing their own style on that front, one of the big things is admittedly, I have not read a gigantic chunk of your back catalog. I'm relatively new to you as an author. And that's going to be true of a lot of, non Stephen King horror people. I'm embarrassed to say it took me into my early 30s to figure out, oh my gosh, there's more than what Barnes and Noble, stocks at the front of the store to the
Uh,
horror genre. But one thing I picked up right away, and anybody I talked with says, yeah, of course, is your ability to kind of build an atmosphere of dread. Now, I wonder, when you started writing, is that something that was intentional, or is it just something that automatically gets injected in every story that you do? Is that just you?
it's
Because you
funny.
seem perfectly pleasant on the surface.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, it's all a facade. Listen, when I take this mask off, you're going to see something very dreadful, but I won't do it just yet. No, I guess it's a bit of both, because it was what I most admired about, well, that's one of the things I most admired about James, M.R. James, and certainly about Lovecraft, perhaps above all, just the way that everything in the story in his best work is geared toward building that sense of, dread and awe, terror. And for me, nobody did it better. In some ways, for me, still nobody does it better. I mean, there are, other writers who do it extraordinarily well. While I'm, shooting out ideas at all directions. If you don't know Adam Neville, I strongly recommend him, a countryman of mine. And there's one of his novels, No One Gets Out Alive, has an extended scene in a house, just going from room to room, it's very much like a nightmare that's never going to end. And just when you think it has, no, there's the next room. I'll say no more than that. But no, I think it comes down to the selection of language and the structure, I think. And again, that's absolutely rooted in Lovecraft for me. And I suppose it is what I try to do, but I suppose it's become kind of instinctive for me now. But I'm conscious of that sort of form of the horror story where you use kind of hints and allusions to very gradually gather a sense of what is there. It's always the kind of story I've most loved anyway. I mean, as a random example, in cinema, I'm a great admirer of the Blair Witch Project, which I actually think is more like a Lovecraft story in some ways than any other film I know, more so in some ways than the actual, official Lovecraft adaptations. Because I think it has so many of the qualities, that sort of, again, the gathering of little hints and allusions and this sort of gathering dread and nothing quite being explained either, certainly not within the film itself. And it certainly did what it was supposed to do for me. And I guess but as I say, for me by now, as a writer, it is the way that I kind of develop a story. It's how it develops in my mind, and I suppose it's I suppose I'm trying to write what I like to read.
Yeah. No, I'm not surprised at all to hear you say that a big part of it is just making sure, kind of poring over and making sure you choose the right word. Earlier when we were talking, you mentioned that movie, I didn't write that part down, but you mentioned a movie, and you were talking about the trees.
Relic or Deranged, those are the two that I got that he mentioned.
No, it was a third one, but you were mentioning the trees slithering down the tracks.
Oh, sorry, that was the Railway Children, yeah, the Jenny Agutter film, yeah.
And that stuck out to me because there's so many ways to say the trees moving down the tracks, but choosing the word slithering just in the moment there is what a vivid picture it paints. What a vivid and unsettling picture it paints.
Yeah, you see, that is how my mind works. That is how I see the world. I suppose you might even say that. So yeah, it's all, just this is what it's like to be me all the time, guys. You just get to read it.
So with that in mind, when you write, and maybe this has changed over your career, but when you write, are you somebody who pours out the first draft and you go back and decide there's a better word later, or do you spend a lot of times working to get one portion right, or is it somewhere in the middle?
It'll be in the middle. I mean, as I said, I think earlier, I write longhand, so that tends to be kind of relatively fluent process. What comes to the rewrite, though, yes, it is a matter of testing every word, really, every sentence, and seeing if I can improve it. I have to say, for me, actually, rewriting is one of the great pleasures of writing. I mean, a lot of it's good fun, actually, in its way, but rewriting, particularly, increasingly so, is something I very much enjoy. But now I think about it, now I'm just pondering your question. When I think about it, when I have, it's probably particularly true in a novel, when I've got a chapter that is basically a kind of, set piece, a scene where you are building up that real sense of the uncanny or of dread. I do take more time over that. And I am, yes, I think I am being more careful about choosing my words as far as I possibly can. And those do tend to take longer, not in a bad way, but even the first draft take longer to write. So yes, I am. I can't. I don't want to take those too fast, and I can't. So yeah, there's a bit of that too.
Very cool. I think we should start talking about The Searching Dead. For
Yeah,
audio listeners, I'm lifting up the book and showing it. It's
there it is. There it is.
Now, is the term reissued? Is that the proper terminology for this?
Well, there was a limited edition from PS Publishing, but this is the first mass market, and mass market in Britain and America simultaneously, and simultaneous ebook and audiobook. So the guys at Flame Tree know what they're doing, I think.
Absolutely. Before we go into that real quick, we are going to give away one paperback version of Ramsey Campbell's The Searching Dead, the first of 3 books. Stay tuned. Follow our Twitter. It is dead_headspace for all the details. So, Brendan, you want to lead the way with this book, or would you like me to, sir?
Well, I mean, let's jump in, Ramsey, and just have you give us kind of the elevator pitch. Give us the shorthand version of what readers can expect. Let's say just in the first book in this trilogy.
Okay. Well, it's set in the. I suppose I probably should give you a bit of a sense of the trilogy. Actually, I mean, it's about 3 friends, and in the Searching Dead, they're at school in the 1950s in Liverpool. We're going to follow them throughout the course of the 3 books. They'll grow up, and they'll hit my age by the end of the trilogy. Actually, because it spans nearly 70 years, the whole thing. Now, in the first one. Dominic, the central character, the narrator, in fact, discovers that a teacher at his school, who is ostensibly a Catholic Christian Brothers type of school, grammar school. In England, a grammar school is a high school, you understand, is involved in the occult, as it transpires, is behind a cult which is located in a derelict or at least deconsecrated church in the middle of the sort of blitzed district of Liverpool, which is what a lot of Liverpool was like in the 50s. These houses have been bombed and were left there derelict for decades, actually. The cult is basically purports to put you in touch with your long lost or recently lost relatives. It's a kind of spiritualist setup, but it becomes apparent that the guy behind it is using the dead, the recently dead, as a kind of proxy to venture into places he doesn't dare to go. So we're getting very much into the area of cosmic horror, and basically these 3 friends, Dominic, Jim, and Bobby, Roberta, are up against him, the founder of the cult, and others too, and it becomes increasingly an issue of how deep do they get in, and what do they call upon themselves while they do it. The other 2 books, as you'll I'm sure appreciate, the thing has not gone away. On the contrary, it gets bigger with that succeeding volume. So it's very much what it basically is. Actually, is me going back to my earliest published ideas, the inhabitant, basically, more specifically a story in there called The Render of the Veils, and I basically felt, I'd not done these ideas justice when I was 16. Well, I didn't have the capability. I really felt that there was more that could be done with them, and I wanted basically to be a bit more worthy of Lovecraft and the whole tradition of cosmic terror than I think I had been in that first book. And that's fundamentally why I wrote the trilogy. That, and that my old friend Pete Crowther of PS Publishing, had kind of gently said to me, or gently insisted to me over the years, that there ought to be a horror trilogy. Well, actually, Jeff Vandermeer got there first with The Reach, which is a great trilogy of his. So I'm trailing along behind, but I think I've done my own thing. So it is one of the pieces of mine that at the moment I'm quite happy with. I'm quite fond of this trilogy. So The Searching Dead will introduce you to the characters in the 1950s, and believe me, that's what Liverpool was really like back then as well.
We had Don Doria on last week, and we talked a little bit about you and The Searching Dead, and he said basically, it was not available like he would have liked it, and just so happens he can make that happen. So I'm glad that he did, and he did mention how there's a lot of Ramsey. We'll ask that specific question later on, unless you want to answer it now. That there's a lot of Ramsey Campbell on the way this year in the foreseeable future. That makes me happy as a horror fan, because I've recently discovered you in the early aughts, but it wasn't through your books. It was before. Let's see, I discovered this documentary, not in the. I apologize, not in the early aughts. Whatever the teens are, the 20 teens are. But the documentary came out in the early aughts. It is Lovecraft, Fear of the Unknown, and
yeah.
I thought you had a lot of interesting things to say. I'm jumping around here, but I'm curious how that project came about.
I don't really know. I mean, the guys approached me, and a lot of other people, because they were doing a documentary on Lovecraft, Just as more recently, there's been a documentary about Carl Edward Wagner that I've been in, The Last Wolf. But I think generally speaking, it's just that these folk, decide we need to do a documentary about this author, and we're going to approach the people who we think would have something good or interesting to say about them. And I genuinely, I'm afraid, I can't remember now how I was approached or when, but it all came together pretty well, I think.
That was a really good way to get introduced to you and a bunch of other people. One of those people who is blurbed on, he did a blurb for, I don't know if it was specifically for The Searching Dead, but Guillermo del Toro wrote an absolute master of modern horror. Hard to argue that from him or about you. So was that blurb for this book, or was it just an older one in general?
No, that was Guillermo on Twitter. He just said that on Twitter off the top of his head one day. But no, funnily enough, there's an anecdote I got to tell you now, which I don't think I've told before. This was way back around the turn of the century, actually. And Jenny and I think maybe, I don't know, the family probably, I don't know, maybe we'd all been away on holiday. It doesn't really matter. We go to Greece. Well, not right now. We don't. Sadly, not on the present circumstances. But generally speaking, we go to Greece once a year for a holiday, and came back, and there were lots of messages on the answer phone, and they were mostly kind of scammy bloody messages saying you've won $1 million and just give us your bank details and and your passport and we'll pay you all this garbage. But then there was one message saying, "Hello, Mr. Campbell. This is Guillermo del Toro calling from Mexico." What? I thought, oh right, yeah. So which one of my friends is putting me on here, And then he went on and he said, basically, I want to make this movie out of a story of yours, and it's going to be part of I think it was New Realm, I forget. What it fundamentally was going to be was a follow-up to the Twilight Zone movie, whereas that was, four stories all based on the Twilight Zone by four different directors. This is going to be a movie by four different directors, but based on short stories which are chosen by them, not particularly from the Rod Serling. And what he wanted to do was a story called Down There. I mean, you'll appreciate that it wasn't a hoax call at all. When I rang the number, no, there's Guillermo. And in fact, we met in Madrid a few years later when Jaume Balaguero had made the film of my novel, The Nameless, Los Sin Nombre. And I was over there helping them promote that movie. And Guillermo actually came over because he wanted to get, just to meet, So we all hung out and had a great time. But sadly, the deal for this movie, they did pay the option, but I think they may even have bought the story for a while. But the deal fell through. Sadly, the movie never got made. However, Guillermo is now producing a Netflix series, and he's bought the story again. So maybe we'll see it after all. So he lives only to make this story of mine. There you go.
I hope so, man.
It's a nice happy ending there. On its way to being a happy ending, at least.
Well, let's hope he does out in the Mountains of Madness as well, though. We're all looking forward to that. But we just hope he does.
I have a feeling he's got some, come hell or high water, he's gonna make that movie happen at some point. He is too, emotionally invested in it to not eventually make that happen, and too big of a name, honestly. If he wants to make that,
seriously.
You would hope. Mind, we sort of did make The Shadow over Innsmouth, I think, as The Shape of Water. So that's a kind of a start,
He just had to trick he had to trick Hollywood into letting him do it.
That's right.
So, Ramsey, one of my favorite aspects of The Searching Dead, and I've been trying to figure out a way to put it into words, and I'm not sure I've succeeded, but the best way I can think to put it is it's subtle coming of age. So many horror coming of age stories kind of take the Stephen King and It approach. They create an authentic environment by, having the kids having a group of like 13-year-olds talk like 13-year-olds actually do, which is very different than is shown on TV. Whereas yours is very much more subdued, but because of that atmosphere of the 50s and the Catholic school and the a whole community that surrounds it, it feels very authentic. It fits very nicely. And, one of the details I really loved, and I don't think this is a spoiler. If you consider it so, we can take it out. But is towards the beginning of the story, the kids really watch their language. They're upstanding members of the community. They would never be caught, uttering a curse word. And then as it goes, very subtly sprinkled in, they start calling people bastards behind their back. They say that's a word we use now. And I love that. It's that kind of coming of age, finding your own sense of, I don't know if maturity is the right word. But no, I'm curious. You said this takes place in 1950s Liverpool, and there really are schools like that. Oh, yeah. How much of the characters are drawn from real life experience?
That's interesting, because actually a lot of people have taken this, this is not a bad thing, but a lot of people have taken this as being more directly autobiographical than it really is. I went to a school like that, although it was rather more vicious than the one in the book, because that's not what the book is about. So that wasn't really something. Elsewhere there's a story of mine called The Interloper, an early short story, which is a lot closer to the kind of ghastly Catholic high school that I really went to. But no, the characters, they're not really based on anybody particular. I mean, Dominic isn't really me, but some of the things he goes through, I went through for sure. But I mean, there's no real equivalent of Bobby in my early life. And well, Jim, he's kind of a conglomerate of best friends. So I suppose we could say that. But because it was an all-male school, an all-boys school, I didn't really have girlfriends at that age at all to speak of. So, Bobby comes out of well, I suppose out of later people, but she's nobody specific. Equally, Christian Noble isn't anyone specific. And the strange thing, I remember this was one thing that really did strike me in the writing of the book. There's that early chapter where you get a page or a page and a half or so, where you just get all the members of staff, little sketches of them, about of all the teachers at that school. They all came out of my head just one morning. Never met any of them. Never met anybody like them, apart actually from the drunken Latin master. He's kind of out of real life, yeah. But he's the only one. The others just they were there somehow. 1 minute they weren't there, the next minute they were somehow up there in my subconscious waiting to come out on the page. And by the end of the morning, there they all were, and I was amazed myself. Didn't quite know where they'd come from. So that's how it works for me.
No, that's interesting, because I could have, I can easily buy that the kids are amalgamations, not necessarily, oh, this is me in 1950s Liverpool. But for some reason, it's the teachers. I would think if you had gone to a school and you said your version was, your real life version was more harsh, but that you'd be pulling those teachers from that experience.
Yes, yeah.
Now, I'm curious. The way the community kind of rallies around the atmosphere of the school, was that common, that any outsider to that faith was really kind of castigated from the community like that?
Yes, there was quite a lot of that. Yes, I mean, I think there were worse places actually. There were places where if you'd not gone to church on Sunday, they'd know, and by God, you'd know on Monday morning. It wasn't quite that bad at the place I went to. And to be fair, there were some very reasonable guys, both among the actual monks and some of the lay staff as well. I mean, by far the best teacher I ever had was an English teacher, sadly no longer with us, called Ray Thomas. He was my last English master, actually. I mean, not mine personally, but of the class I was in. And I don't know anybody who was better at just conveying his love of the language and of literature. So even to a kind of class full of 15, 16-year-olds, he was managing to make Shakespeare live and Matthew Arnold, for God's sake, live, which is no easy task, believe me. I can't imagine it would be. Although even going back, I mean, earlier, there was a guy called Brother Kelly who was in my first year at that school, and he encouraged me, well, he got me to read my horror stories to the class. I mean, I doubt that they'd get away with that now. A couple of them were pretty gruesome, even the stuff I was writing when I was 11. In fact, in some ways, the stuff I was writing when I was 11, probably more gruesome than the stuff I write now. But actually, it was the prose that was gruesome in the wrong sense.
Yeah. Now, you said that the teachers, for the most part, came out of your head, but and I'm spacing on the name, but the teacher that kind of in a sly manner encourages Dominic's writing, even though the headmaster is not super on board with that. I almost think it's fair to say, that doesn't mean that that's Brother Thomas. That's I feel like every school has that teacher, the one that is willing to buck authority a little bit in the interest of allowing a kid to develop and not necessarily follow the one narrow straight path that society tries to put you on.
Yeah, I'm sure, or at least we'd hope that was the case, wouldn't we? I think, yeah. And yeah, I think you are right. I think mostly there is one, or maybe more than one,
Yeah. And I love the way that, the whole, I don't know, I can't think of a better word than antagonism, kind of gets set up. And I won't go too far with this because the book comes out on February 16th, and we want people to grab that Flame Tree version, the out in paperback, hardcover, and ebook. But the way that it starts out as a little bit of a kinship, and then that between Christian Noble and the kids, or at least Dominic, and the rift develops from there, and just the way that's explored, through various scenes. I know I have one coming to mind with I'll just say a creepy child, and
Yeah.
I just thought it happened very naturally over the course of 240 some odd pages.
You're going to see a lot more of her in the second and third volumes, I have to tell you, but of course she'll have grown up by then.
Oh
And
no.
Don mentioned that the second one, let's see, actually, Born to the Dark comes out at the end of this year. Is that right?
I think it's October, is it? I think it's October.
Okay, yeah, okay, October. Oh, yeah, that comes out in October, and you have a original coming out at the end of the year. Do I have that right?
I believe June, right?
Now the third volume is going to be. I think the third is next April, so they're going to have to wait a little while. But no, the original novel, the new novel that is previously unpublished, that's June. That's actually June. A book called Somebody's Voice.
Okay, my apologies.
Oh no, not at all. Don't worry.
Just gonna put this out there. I know I can speak for Brendan on this. Is you are by far the most polite person I've ever talked to on Twitter and in person. There's one other person, a friend of mine, a writer from England. I don't know if you've heard of him, but Lex H. Jones. He wrote this book, a children's picture book called "The Old One in the Sea." And then there's
oh no.
Another author named Laura Morrow made these. It's Cthulhu and young Howard Phillips.
Yes, absolutely.
And I gotta tell you, it's the only story I read where Lovecraft's this cute, adorable monster, and I think you'd like it. That kind of came out of nowhere, but I don't know. You love Lovecraft. I think I really love how he creates the atmosphere too. I meant to mention that earlier. That's why I think it's coming out of me. But it's fascinating to me. You got, and not just him, but so many other authors or creators. But you got this one author that's pretty much all he was. Maybe I'm wrong. I've never read his letters, but that's pretty much all he was good at. And he didn't have a great childhood, so I'm not blaming him for that, obviously. But he affects so many people years down the line. And you were talking about someone being the last link in the chain. I think you do that quite well, to be honest, because everyone I've talked about with you, I feel like I've talked to quite a few people about you. Very good things to say as a writer and a person. So that's my, I guess you can call it fanboy. I keep doing that on episodes, but I can't help it. I talked to so many awesome authors. Last night was Jar Lansdale. Tonight's you. Well, Gabino and Sean and Seeing Two, they're great. But that came out of nowhere, man. I just had to say that.
Thank you very much. You bet.
Do you attribute the kind of humbleness that you have? And I'm not trying to sound like I'm kissing your ass now, but do you attribute the humbleness that you have for anyone that came before you that maybe taught you remember your roots? Because I mean, my father always said, no matter where you end up in life, you got to remember where you came from. And I didn't come from a poor family, but I mean, I'd like to think that, and I've seen it with a lot of successful people that are good people, that they seem to do that, and you seem to do it too. But I'm curious if that was a lesson you were taught at a young age.
No, I don't think so. No, I think what it more probably was actually working with August Derleth. He helped me, in any number of ways, not just as a writer actually, because he did kind of give me life advice, because my father was not around at all. I didn't see him. He was around. He was in the same house. I just didn't see him face to face. He was on the other side of the door for like 20 some years of my life. So that was a kind of strange situation in itself. And so Derleth became a kind of surrogate father. He gave me the kind of fatherly advice you might expect that when you're an adolescent. But it was also, I think that he sort of passed on his knowledge as a writer, an editor, if you like, to me. And I've kind of tried to help other writers, in the same way over like a lot of my life, really. And it's odd because actually looking back, taking it back another step, that exactly what happened with Lovecraft to August. Lovecraft was Derleth's kind of mentor as a correspondent. They never actually met. Well, mind you, sadly, I never met August either. I mean, by the time I got to Sauk City, which is in 75, Unfortunately, he died some years ago. Oh, incidentally, I know this is kind of shoehorning it in when I should have said this an hour ago. But of course, the guy I completely forgot, and one of the greatest people I met in Providence at that first World Fantasy Convention was Fritz Leiber, a tremendous writer. And I and many others, well, probably everybody was there, had the unique pleasure of hearing Fritz read The Haunts of the Dark aloud at midnight at the convention. And in fact, gosh, now here's an anecdote. The next year was the World Fantasy Convention was in New York, and in fact, Jenny, my wife, that was the first one she went to, because she was a teacher, but she managed to get time off for that one before we had the kids, and then after that, for a while, I had to go on my own, and then subsequently, of course, we always go together. But anyway, I'm getting off the point. The point was that in New York, Fritz was one of the guests of honor, and I was also a guest. And Jack Sullivan, who was among other things, a great authority on supernatural horror. He edited the Penguin Encyclopedia of Horror and the Supernatural, and I generally used to stay with Jack on the Upper West Side in New York whenever I was over, and he would get me to read to his friends, and actually it was quite a decent bunch of friends with, like Ted Klein and Gahan Wilson and Tom Dish and so forth, and Kirby McCauley, of course. But this particular time, I suggested to Fritz that would he like to come over and do a reading, and so we did a reading together at Jack's, and that was a memorable evening, believe me. And Fritz did Little Old Miss Macbeth. That was his story. It was a very strange little, only Fritz could have written that story. A strange apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic vision like nobody else's. So that was a great evening. So I'm just throwing that out there.
That sounds really fun. I was supposed to go to conventions for the first time last year, but coronavirus killed that. So when I hear y'all talking to author,
that's a real pity, not because of the coronavirus, but we could have met it because we were at Providence a couple of years ago, when the StokerCon was there. So sadly you didn't make it. Pity though.
Yeah. But what year was that? Do you remember?
No, it was it's like around 2015, something like that, maybe.
So that's the year I moved from New England to my wife's home state of New Jersey. But I wish I was more so a part of the horror community then, because I didn't really start to know about conventions until like 2 years ago.
Yeah, I understand.
I lost track of what my question or point of all this was.
Well, you know what? You were talking about, humble roots and stuff like that. And, the one thing I would throw in there is it seems to me like any names that stick in this genre and this industry for decades or more, they all have that mentality that you learned and you were helped out by the people who came before you, and you owe it to the next generation to give as well, to not just kind of cut that link in the chain, to use the metaphor we've been kind of throwing out there, to keep giving back to the community and inspire and help out the next generation of writers, really.
Sure. No, I mean, just right now, for instance, I'm reading The Fisherman, John Langan, and that's quite something for sure. So, yeah.
He's nice. He's a nice guy. I wanted to ask you real quick, and maybe I'm just dense, if you're okay with talking about what exactly you meant. You only heard your father through the other side of the door. I don't even know what that means. Is that...
Well, okay. I mean, you can read a great deal about this in my... I will tell you, but, if you want to know more about the stuff, because clearly I'm going to have to summarize it. But, in my non-fiction book, Ramsey Campbell Probably, yet another PS book. There's a long autobiographical essay in that, which will tell you a lot more than I'll have time to do now. But to kind of cut it down to the basics. My parents were estranged when I was very young, like I think 3 years old, for a whole variety of different reasons. And basically I had to, it was kind of put to me that I got to make the choice between my mother or my father. It was simple as that. Do you want to go out with your father or not? And because I'd seen this kind of ghastly physical row erupt, I mean, I thought basically probably some at the back of my mind was, I'd caused this. So, I said, well, no, I don't want to go anymore. And that was the end of my relationship with my father. So for the next, let me see, I didn't move out of the house till Jenny and I met. So this would have been, I was 24 when I moved out. So up to that point, my father was just this presence in the house. And you kind of heard him on, going upstairs at night or coming down in the morning. But I never saw him, or virtually never saw him. There were maybe half a dozen occasions when, he and my mother came face to face. But even then, he wasn't really, coming for me. But he used to leave presents around the house on my birthday or Christmas, which was kind of strange. Books, actually, inevitably, in fact, yeah. But he became this sort of monstrous figure. And this is exacerbated by the fact that, sadly, my mother was, as far as I am aware, undiagnosed until nearly the end of her life. But she was a paranoid schizophrenic, increasingly so as time wore on. But, even early on, my father became this sort of monstrous figure who was, quite capable of poisoning us in the night. If we didn't, watch what we drank or ate, this kind of a thing. And so you can imagine that, this kind of had some shaping effect on possibly the kind of thing that I write. I'm not saying, I mean, it often comes up. I mean, Doug Winter used to say, or did say, in an interview that, he felt that I was, of all the people he'd met in the field, that I was the guy who was most kind of born to write what I write, or my background and upbringing kind of led there. I mean, the truth, I mean, I've often thought about that, I've wondered about that. I think the truth is I don't know, because it's like saying, if I weren't who I am, who would I be, And I still think I would have had the love of the field, and that would have led to me writing in it. But maybe the kind of psychological preoccupations of a lot of my stories, maybe that comes out of there. That seems likely, I think, yeah.
Sure. I mean, I heard this or watched this interview with Stephen King where he talked about how his mother told him that he saw, for those that haven't heard it, they saw when he was a child, he came home all shaken up, and I believe he saw his friend get hit by a train or killed by a train.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Yeah, he's not sure why he loves horror for the same reason none of us know, but could make a case maybe that kind of started something.
And of course, I was going to say, of course, Clive Barker, when he was about that age, was taken to see, it was an aeronautics exhibition of some sort, a display. And I think I'm right in saying that someone fell out of a plane. So this was, he saw a man fall to his death when he was about 3 or 4 years old, Clive. And again, clearly that, it's going to be a shaping experience, I think. Although I think he sees it as a kind of Prometheus image almost, the guy who falls from the sky. The kind of thing that Clive writes,
That I haven't even thought of it. That's fair. And then I think, I can't speak for Brian, but for myself, I don't think I've ever seen anyone. I know I haven't seen anyone dead except for at funerals.
Yeah.
Nothing's really shaped me like that. Like I saw the Stephen King adaptation of it in 1990, and I was 1 at the time, and I know that gave me nightmares. But
well, yeah, that would do it. Yeah.
And my mother told me when I was a 3-year-old, I used to cry that there was a witch in my room, which still creeps me out because I don't want to really evaluate the psychology of that. But I don't know. I think it's just in us.
Yes.
But I think like Lovecraft said, it's in all of us, man. Like fear is like the most primal emotion that we have. But we want to explore it. Brendan, why don't you take over, sir?
Yeah, you know what? Just going off that, and that I'm gonna steal somebody's words, and I want to say it was John F.D. Taft. He says that if you ask somebody off the street, they'll say the 2 most primal emotions are love and hate, and it's not hate at all; it's fear. Any time that you have hate, it's typically you can dive deeper and base that hate off fear. You can trace it back to fear. And I would definitely agree with that. He's a lot smarter than I am, but he put it well.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, yeah. Can we talk about that anthology? Because they mentioned it, and I know that you have an afterword in it. Without spoilers, are you comfortable or allowed to talk about that?
Oh, Dark Stars, you mean?
Yeah, because that, I mean, come on, man. That's got not every, but that's got man, that's an all-star cast. Like, on the top of my head, it's, excuse me, Alma Katsu, John Yu, Josh Mallerman, Carolyn Kepnes, and Stephen Graham Jones. I know there's more, but that's just who I remember.
John Langdon is in there, actually. John Langdon. Priya Sharma, she's there. I mean, they're terrific stories, because I did the afterword.
Yeah.
I contributed the story too, actually, but so I've read them all. I think we've got one more coming. Better not say who from, because that's a bit late, but so we won't say that. But no, it's a splendid book. I'll tell you, incidentally, I think John Taft's story is quite extraordinary. I mean, really, absolutely over the edge, powerful stuff. So yeah, look forward to that book. You'll be glad you did.
Yeah, we're gonna have John on and hopefully others for that. That'd be amazing. We're very excited for that book as fans of the genre in general.
We're also gonna pretend that segue was intentional too.
Yes.
To John F.D. Taft.
Yes.
Super intentional.
So speaking of awkward segues, Ramsey, you mentioned that you had an original book, rather as opposed to a reissue, coming out in June. Somebody's Voice. What can you tell us about that?
Well, now I was going to say it's a departure, but it's probably no more a departure than half a dozen other books that I've written. So if there's half a dozen books, it's not really a departure, is it? It's like one of the threads of what I do. It's not supernatural though. It's psychological thriller, shall we say? It's certainly a crime novel. Okay, basically, excuse me, central character, crime novelist who has run into problems with his new novel because people are saying that he's basically, he's taken themes of child abuse and gender reassignment, and basically he's being accused of exploiting these without, having had his, experienced them himself. So his publishers, to try and restore things, hire him as a ghostwriter for a survivor of child abuse. But as he works on this book and as it's published, his own sense of identity and having lived through the experiences in the way of the person whose life he is writing becomes increasingly undermined, and it also becomes apparent that not all the reminiscences of the person whose life he is writing are literally true, and some of the people who are supposed to be dead aren't, and basically want their say. That's how the book develops. There's more to it than that. It's disquieting, I hope.
It sounds like it's very relatable. I know, for example, the Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon, Thomas Harris's first two Hannibal Lecter books were those are two of my favorite. I hold those up as the best crime books ever, like dark horror crime. That's just my opinion. They're awesome, but I know that they were criticized, Silence of the Lambs, for attacking, I believe it was transgenders, and then Red Dragon for portraying someone with, forgive me if I'm messing up the diagnosis, but schizophrenia. That's an extreme case. My wife's a social worker, and she kind of instilled in me about approaching why she doesn't like horror movies, how they exploit that. But I can see those points. That's not how I feel about those books, but I bring that up because that's what your story is pretty much about, and I think that's super relatable. And put your spin on it is gonna be, you sold me, man. I want to read that right now.
Oh, okay. There'll be advanced copies pretty soon, I think. Yeah.
Oh, that's through Flame Tree, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought so. Just had to double check.
One each.
I wanted to jump to one more thing. I found something very interesting. Is from April 1990. You were a part of a roundtable discussion with legends, you yourself being one of them, called Horror Cafe with host Clive Barker. Some of the guests there were Lisa Tuttle, Roger Corman, John Carpenter, and Peter Atkins.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're into horror, whether it's cinema or literature, you should check that out. It's free on YouTube that I know of, but I don't know where else you can get it. How'd that even come up, man? Like, who was that? Barker's idea?
No, it was the BBC. I think it was the actual BBC rather than a production company that sold it to them. But the idea was going to be that there would be a series of programs like this, in each of which you'd have half a dozen, specialists in that field, and they would get around. They would actually do this thing of getting them around a table and actually serving them a dinner, with food and wine, and you would probably observe I ate most of it, as many people pointed out at the time. It was just clever editing that. Everybody else ate as well. They just cut to me whenever I'm eating, bastards. That's different. But it was going to be a series. I don't know what all of them were going to be, but one was alternative comedy, in fact. So they had 6 alternative comedians, like edgy comedians, I don't know who they were, but apparently what happened was, whereas the horror writers, as you've seen, or anybody who looks at it on YouTube will see, we all got on, horror writers and horror filmmakers all got on extremely well,
Yeah.
The comedians didn't get on at all. And they started swearing at each other, and, I think eventually flinging things at each other across the table. And the producer eventually came out, because obviously, these things were filmed for twice as long as they run, so there's a lot of stuff edited out. The producer came out and eventually said, listen, guys, cool it. And one of them got it up and buttered her. And that was that's why you never saw that program, and that's why the series never took off as a series, because they said, Christ, no, we've had enough, But, the horror writers, we got to be it, therefore. And so it's going to be The Something Cafe for, I think, 6 episodes. And the Horror Cafe is the only one that ever got together. But no, they came up with the idea of getting us all together. And, I think I can't remember now whether we actually sat down and said, okay, who's going to be, the chairperson. And we all said, okay, Clive, you're it, or whether Clive suggested he should be it. We all concurred. But basically, what you see is pretty well how it went. Now, I'm sorry, I know you're going to contradict me here, so you don't contradict me, guys.
Keeping my mouth shut.
I'm only teasing. But what I'm saying, as far as I'm concerned, one of the things it shows is I'm no bloody good at brainstorming at all. I'm really not much good at that. I'm a sort of solitary creator. I do it myself all in my own head. And going around the table with 6 other people saying, okay, now what's your idea? Let's tell this story as a round robin. That was really what I kind of seized up. So thank God I had sufficient wine to drink. But I didn't do too well at that, I don't think. And I mean, there's one cut. I mean, you can probably leave this in unless you have very sensitive listeners. But John Carpenter, he was immediately before me in the round, so he eventually brought in quantum physics, which is then and still maybe a favourite thing of his. I think it shows up. You can sort of see undercurrents of it in Prince of Darkness, actually. But it was something he was very
definitely.
Okay, so he does his his little bit of the story and ends up with a sort of quantum physics thing. And in the original cut, I sort of stare at him and say, "Fuck you, John." And that is not now in the broadcast, I'm afraid. But I eventually did come up with something, some sorry addition to the story. Anyway, we all had a great time, and then it turned out to be Roger Corman's birthday, so they wheeled out this bloody crate of champagne after we'd finished filming, And we all glugged champagne immoderately, and were eventually kind of poured into taxis and taken off to the Ritz or wherever we were staying, with some, or the Savoy, I forget which one, some very palatial hotel. I remember getting up in the morning thinking, oh, I don't feel too bad, actually. Went down to breakfast. There was a wonderful buffet, best buffet I've ever seen outside of Singapore, where the buffets are so big that you see people lost in the maze 3 days later still looking for their table. But the Savoy, or whatever buffet it was in London, that's pretty good too. So I loaded up my plate, went and took back to my table, sat down, and kind of took up my knife and fork and stared at this, and suddenly went away from it very fast and was not seen again for quite a long time. So unfortunately, the champagne did have its effect, and I remember sitting on the train, eventually back to Liverpool, thinking, just going to die. I'll die. Let me die. I just want to die. Let me die. I'll die. I'll just sit here and die. And then I went to sleep and came into Liverpool. Felt fine, So there you are. I don't know what that proves, but anyway, it proves the resilience of the horror writer. That's what it proves.
I'd like to point out how you said that the comedians were all going at each other. The horror writers were having a good time, which you could pick up as a viewer. You can't. Not everyone. I don't like making blanket statements because they're not accurate. But most horror writers are very kind. Some of the kindest people that you'll ever meet.
Yeah.
And I lost my train of thought again. I'm so sorry.
That's how we creep up on you, behind you, with our knives. That's why we're so nice. Don't you understand that? Don't you understand?
I do.
I don't like that at all.
I just remembered Lisa Tuttle. I'm so happy that she was on there because maybe it's just me, but I don't see her discussed enough. Just like you got people like you and Joe R. Lansdale and Stephen King, obviously, who are always talked about. No, but guys like Ronald Kelly, you, not you. I'm sorry, you're talked about a lot too. I don't know. I said you. People like Ronald Kelly and Lisa Tuttle. They've been around since the 70s and 80s, and I would like to see them come back. I know.
I'm glad to say there is a recent reprint of A Nest of Nightmares, the Lisa's collection. That's very rare for a long time, but now you can buy it. So everybody go and buy it now, guys, before you do anything else.
What's the name? Vandercourt or
Valancourt?
Valancourt. Yes.
I saw the cover. It looks gorgeous. Ramsey, so we're kind of wrapping down, and I don't want to miss anything that you want to promote or talk about. So, Brennan, I want to know if you have anything that you want to discuss before we kind of ask our final questions.
Well, obviously, the flame tree. Oh, I'm sorry, Brandon, you wanted to say. Brandon?
No, I was just going to say I don't have anything to add, so Ramsey, go ahead.
Well, I just called you Brandon, so that's a bloody good start, isn't it? Sorry about that. Okay.
You got close.
Oh, dear me. Okay, well, listen. Well, of course, there are all the Flame Tree books. They're great guys. And Don is splendid, as is Nick Wells. Is over here in England. But the whole team. I'm extremely happy with them, and I hope they do extremely well. They're doing extremely well for me, I'll tell you that. So Flame Tree generally, and they have got, as you say, they're going to be doing more backlists, but they have got several other books of mine. And actually, they've got 13 Days by Sunset Beach, for instance, which is a recent novel, which I'm quite fond of that one. PS Publishing, now they have got currently 2 huge retrospective volumes of short stories of mine called Phantasmagorical Stories. So those are my selection of from like 60 years of short fiction, really. I've tried to do an overview there. Over 1,000 pages of them, by gum.
Wow.
There's limericks of God, what am I calling it? There's my limerick collection anyway, which is a history of horror fiction in the form of 50 limericks. Let me tell you. Let me see. Can I do one? Never. Oh yes, there's an M.R. James. Here's an M.R. James limerick for you. Never mutter near Magnus's casket, for he's wont to pop off if you ask it. Once the locks have dropped off, that demonic old toff will trash a lot more than your gasket. There you go. That's M.R. James of the
Oh my
limerick.
goodness, that's a tongue twister. Well,
That's
well
an
done.
exclusive. We have never had anybody read limericks on the show before.
Oh well, just stop me now. You get some more. What else am I doing? Well, yeah. The other thing, PS are going to be doing my collected reviews column from Video Watchdog. I did film reviews over there for a long time. There'll be a second non-fiction collection just of general stuff. And finally, last but not least, and this is the one you never thought you were going to hear me say, unless you knew about it anyway, a study of the Three Stooges.
No, I didn't. Whoa, no, I did not expect that.
But it's actually called Six Stooges and Counting. And if you know about the Stooges, you'll understand that title, because there were at least, six, not counting fake Shemps,
Yeah.
The strangest career in some ways of any comedy team in Hollywood. And I've got to say, the more I watch them, the more interesting they become. I think, I was, long ago I dismissed them as being like, I'm a Laurel and Hardy man particularly, and Keaton and Chaplin, Harold Lloyd. But there's a whole lot more to the Stooges than I thought there was when I originally encountered their films. And I've watched all of their short films now, several times actually. And the more I see, then the more I see to see. So that's in the pipeline. It'll be a while yet before it's completed.
Well, I'm curious to find out when that comes out and whatnot. That is definitely unexpected from at least my. So I'm curious, what are you currently reading?
Right now, The Fisherman, the John Langan, and very fine it is, I think. Yeah, and also a book called Lord now by Jeff Young. It's his reminiscence of 50s Liverpool, which I hadn't read when I wrote The Searching Dead, but it's resurrecting all sorts of memories I'd forgotten. It's like my own memories, maybe some I didn't even know I had. Which is called Ghost Town.
Okay.
So those are the two things I'm doing right now, reading.
Brennan, what are you reading?
I am semi between things right now. I just finished Clementine's Awakening by Jennifer Susie. It's kind of a Southern Gothic ghost story with a bit more violence to it than I guess I expect out of a Southern Gothic ghost story, but maybe that's just me. And I'm about to jump into Todd Kiesling's A Life Transparent, the first book he's got in a trilogy that he started, that he wrote the first two books to. Gosh, Patrick, do you know when he did that?
I want to say like 10 years ago he started it. I can't.
Could have been almost 10 years, yeah. So he wrote the third book in that series, and he's got them all being reissued, and then book 3 will be out for the first time through Bloodshot this year.
Actually, I don't know if you've heard of Todd Kiesling before, Ramsey, but he came out with a book last year called Devil's Creek, and he builds up an excellent atmosphere. He has this Lovecraftian God in it that I haven't read before. I think it's worth a read if you're ever looking for a new title.
Yeah, I'll check him out. I've heard of him but not read him, so yes, I'll definitely give him a shot. He's
a really kind person too. He's been personally very helpful to me and a good friend. So
Okay.
I think his name's gonna blow up eventually too.
His book's up for the Stoker this year, so pulling for him, hoping for him.
Yeah, okay.
It seems like it's a Salem's Lot sort of deal, where it's just a tome of a book that's gonna last for decades. I am reading right now. I know listeners can't see this, but it is called Hearts, Strange and Dreadful by an author named Tim McGregor. It's a history horror based in the 1800s in New England. I'll keep it at that. And I'm also reading Jennifer Susie's book that Brennan just mentioned. To listeners that forgot or need a reminder, possibly, Ramsey Campbell's The Searching Dead, part 1 of the trilogy. We're having a paperback giveaway. All you have to do is go to dead_headspace for more details, and maybe you can win a copy absolutely free. It's easy to put your name in. Just pay attention to that profile, and you might win it. And last question there, Ramsey, is where can people follow you?
Oh, on Facebook, you'll find me on Facebook just as Ramsey Campbell, and on Twitter as Ramsey Campbell, believe it or not. You know, so the John's completely gone, so no confusion there. It's all Ramsey Campbell out there, man. Yeah.
And I'd just like to take an opportunity to throw out a little ad for a newer author. His name's Shane Hawk, Indigenous horror writer. I'm wearing his shirt. Audio listeners won't see it, but it is for his press called Black Hills Press. All you gotta do is go to shanehawk.com/merch for his t-shirts. They're pretty awesome. He came out with a new book, self-published book called Anoka. In case you have not read Indigenous horror, well, Stephen Graham Jones is a great start, so is he. Ramsey Campbell, we've taken almost 2 hours of your time. I can't believe we got to talk to you, man. It's just been so easy. It's been a pleasure. You are one of the easiest people. I can't talk, I'm stuttering. You're one of the easiest people to talk to.
Now,
And,
well, the reason you're blocking on that is because you know I'm not really a person.
you did tell me you're going to take your mask off, so I'm a little scared to end the episode.
Luckily for you, it's too dark. You can't really see it.
And we would just like to extend this. We would like to talk to you any other time in the future. It would be our pleasure. Brennan, any final thoughts, sir?
Nope, I echo what you said. He is the very easy to talk to humanoid-like creature.
Ramsey, any final thoughts, sir?
No. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you guys. Thank you very much for having me. And I hope people were entertained, because I like to entertain people. And if they're not entertained, I come and entertain them in the dark.